Picture two thrones, and on the first sits a king, the very image of divine justice. Before him stand two women, each claiming to be the mother of a single infant. With a wisdom that seems to cut through the fabric of human deceit, the king calls for a sword, threatening to divide the child. His gambit works, revealing the true mother's heart and cementing his reputation as the wisest ruler who ever lived. This is King Solomon of the Bible, a figure revered in all the Abrahamic faiths for his unparalleled holiness and wisdom. Now picture a second throne, this one shrouded in the occult and inscribed with arcane symbols. The king who sits here is no less powerful, but his authority extends beyond the mortal realm. He stands within a protective circle, holding a glowing ring that bears an otherworldly seal. With words of power, he commands the groveling princes of hell, binding legions of demons to his will and forcing them to erect a temple of impossible grandeur. This too is King Solomon, the archetypal sorcerer and grand master of Western occultism. How did the celebrated king, whose wisdom was a mark of divine favor, transform into the legendary Magus who could traffic with demons and command spirits? The legend of Solomon the magician didn't spring from nothing. The canonical biblical texts, while containing no explicit magic, planted the seeds from which a supernatural reputation could grow. These accounts provided the raw material, a narrative framework of divine gifts, immense knowledge, and moral ambiguity that later traditions would reinterpret. The story begins with a divine encounter. In a dream, God offers the newly crowned Solomon anything he desires. Instead of asking for the usual things like wealth, long life, or the defeat of his enemies, the young king asks for a mind to understand and govern his people. This selfless request pleases God so immensely that he not only grants Solomon wisdom unparalleled by any king before or after, but also bestowed him the riches he didn't request. This establishes a critical precedent. Solomon's extraordinary abilities are supernatural in origin, a direct endowment from the divine. The Bible then specifies the nature of this wisdom. It wasn't merely judicial or political, but rather in breadth of knowledge of everything from the natural world. He is known to have had immense knowledge of flora and fauna, the latter of which would later develop into the legend that he could directly converse with animals. Solomon's greatest worldly achievement, the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem, also provided fertile ground for folklore. The biblical account details a project of immense scale, requiring vast resources of timber, gold, and stone, and taking 7 years to complete. The sheer magnificence and logistical complexity of the temple fed into a persistent belief that such a feat couldn't have been accomplished by mortal labor alone. Combined with the understanding of this divine wisdom, this created a narrative opening for the idea of supernatural assistance. Finally, the Bible is unflinching in its account of Solomon's decline. In his later years, his 700 wives and 300 concubines, many from foreign lands, introduced their gods to the land. He allowed them to build shrines for the worship of their deities, drawing the wrath of God directly upon him. This act is perhaps the most crucial element in his transformation. In the eyes of the believer, it creates a moral ambiguity, a problem with an otherwise righteous king. This spiritual failing provides the perfect narrative justification for his later association with forbidden knowledge and the summoning of non-divine entities. It suggests a man who, despite his divine gifts, strayed into darker, esoteric realms. Notably, the biblical account, while rich in describing Solomon's wisdom and accomplishments, is conspicuously silent on the precise mechanics of his power, which will be important. If the Bible planted the seeds of Solomon's magical reputation, a curious text from late antiquity made them bloom. The Testament of Solomon is the foundational document that transforms the wise king into an arch-magician and provides the detailed backstory for his command over demons. This work, which isn't accepted as scripture in any Abrahamic faith, filled the narrative vacuum left by the biblical accounts with a vivid and systematic demonology. Written in Greek sometime around the 2nd century AD, the Testament is a pseudepigraphical work, meaning it was falsely attributed to Solomon himself to lend it authority. It's a fascinating blend of Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman magical traditions, reflecting the syncretic spiritual world in which it was born. The story of how Solomon bound the demons and made them his servants opens during the construction of the temple. A favored young servant is being tormented by a demon named Orneus, who steals half his pay and food and drains his life force by sucking his right thumb. And yeah, trust me, that'll be the least unusual thing about this entire story, so strap in. Distressed by his servant's decline, Solomon prays fervently in the temple for the power to subdue the demon. In answer to his prayer, the archangel Michael appears and gives him a small ring with a seal engraved upon it, the pentalpha, later known as the Seal of Solomon. This ring, Michael explains, is a gift from God that will allow him to seal all the demons that roam the earth. Solomon uses the ring to summon, interrogate, and bind a vast host of demons, basically playing an ancient history version of Shin Megami Tensei. The text functions as a veritable demonological manual, and he compels each spirit to reveal its name, its malevolent function, and its associated astrological body. Most importantly, he forces the demons to reveal the name of the angel or the divine phrase that can thwart its power. This process effectively categorized the demonic world, transforming demons from abstract forces of evil into a classified list of specific agents of affliction. Crucially, Solomon doesn't merely banish these demons, he claps them in spiritual cuffs and then puts them to work, against their will. According to this tale, he then used them in building the very temple whose construction had puzzled later generations. Each demon was assigned a specific task, which Solomon believed the creature to be uniquely suited for, based upon its malevolent purpose. The demon Orneus, for instance, is forced to cut stones, while the powerful Asmodeus is made to tread clay for the bricks. Other demons are tasked with everything from being job site gophers to overseeing parts of the project in their own right. And yeah, if you think your boss is bad, just try to work for a demon who isn't doing the job willingly. This masterstroke of storytelling directly connects Solomon's magical power to his greatest biblical achievement, providing a supernatural explanation for its legendary grandeur. The Testament concludes by echoing the biblical account of Solomon's fall, but with a magical twist. Seduced by a foreign woman, he agrees to sacrifice to her gods. Solomon, ultimately being a faithful person, thought there would be no harm in a minor nominal sacrifice. However, with this act, all the gifts that God had given him departed, and he was left powerless to both humans and demons. The Testament of Solomon provided the narrative, but it was during the Middle Ages that this story was transformed into a system of practice. A new genre of texts emerged, the grimoire, or magical handbook. Falsely attributed to King Solomon to grant them an aura of ancient and holy authority, these books were not stories, but practical manuals for aspiring magicians. They promised to teach the very arts that the legendary king had mastered before he squandered it all. There was also another more pressing reason why these grimoires were tied to Solomon. If they weren't tied to someone of undoubted holiness, they could much more easily be construed as books composed of ancient and evil magic, in essence, regular illegal witchcraft. The most famous of these are the Key of Solomon and its later, more notorious offshoot, the Lesser Key of Solomon. Likely written in the 14th century in Italy and compiled from earlier medieval occult traditions, these works moved beyond folklore into codified ritual. They provided step-by-step instructions for everything the ceremonial magician needed. This included rites of personal purification, fasting, and prayer, as well as blueprints for crafting magical tools like wands, swords, and robes. There were, of course, lists of incantations and conjurations to summon and compel spirits to do the operator's will. The goals of these spells were generally focused on gaining power, gaining knowledge or wisdom, finding treasure, or falling in love. The first book of the Lesser Key, known as the Ars Goetia, became the definitive text on Solomonic demonology. It presents a highly organized and bureaucratic vision of the infernal realms. The text catalogues 72 specific demons, whom Solomon supposedly sealed with his magical ring. Each demon is assigned a rank within a complex feudal-style hierarchy, reflective of medieval Europe. There are kings like Baal and Paimon, great princes of hell like Stolas, dukes like Barbados, amongst many others. And I know more than a few Genshin Impact players probably just had to pause the video right there for a second, because yeah, you heard that name correctly. For each of these 72 spirits, the Ars Goetia provides a unique sigil, or seal, a cryptic symbol that acts as the demon's spiritual signature and the key to its summoning. It also describes the demon's appearance and its specific powers, or the knowledge it can impart. For example, King Baal, the first spirit listed, can teach the art of invisibility, while President Marbas can cause and cure diseases and improve knowledge of machines. Notably, according to the book, the magician doesn't worship the demons. They beat them into submission spiritually, using divine and angelic powers, just like Solomon. The journey of King Solomon from a wise ruler to a master of demons is a testament to the power of storytelling and the enduring human desire to understand and control the unseen world. This Solomonic tradition became foundational to the development of Western ceremonial magic. By attributing their forbidden arts to a revered biblical king, magicians could frame their practice not as a wicked invention, but as a lost, sacred science. This act lent a crucial veneer of legitimacy to esoteric systems, allowing them to exist in a complex, symbiotic relationship with the mainstream religions from which they drew their power. Crucially, this air of legitimacy allowed the practice to be tolerated to a greater or lesser degree, even when other forms of magic ran the risk of the practitioner ending up on the stake. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell, and turn on all notifications when you do so. For whatever reason, these days simply hitting subscribe doesn't guarantee you'll see new videos that I post. The night of January 3rd, 1804, was cold, damp, and oppressively dark in the village of Hammersmith, then a small rural outpost on the western fringe of London. Its unlit passages, like the notorious Black Lion Lane, were narrow and enclosed by high hedges, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead even on a clear night. But this was not a clear night, and a mist crept up from the river, and a deeper, more chilling fog of fear had settled over the community for months. This was a named terror, a phantom that stalked the churchyard and its surrounding lanes, a specter the locals called the Hammersmith Ghost. Just after 11 o'clock, a lone figure dressed entirely in white moved through the gloom of Black Lion Lane. From the shadows, another man emerged, armed to the teeth and potentially boozed to the hilt, ready to face this so-called ghost. He leveled his weapon and shouted a challenge into the darkness, and when he got no response, he started blasting. The shooter, a 29-year-old officer named Francis Smith cautiously approached what he believed was the vanquished specter that had terrorized his neighbors. But instead of a pile of ectoplasm, he found warm, solid flesh. Instead of a shroud, he found the clean white work clothes of a local tradesman. The ghost was Thomas Millwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, his white flannel waistcoat and linen trousers now rapidly staining red. In a single panicked moment, a ghost story had been brutally inverted. The hunt for a supernatural monster had ended in a very human tragedy, and the true horror was not the phantom, but the violence born from the fear of it. This event would pose a profound question to the English legal system, one it was utterly unprepared to answer. Can a man be guilty for slaying a ghost he genuinely believed was real? The tragedy that unfolded in Black Lion Lane was not the result of a single man's rash action, but the culmination of a perfect storm of social hysteria and cultural superstition. For 2 months, from November 1803, the community of Hammersmith had been gripped by a growing panic. The sightings began as whispers and escalated into terrifying tales. Witnesses gave inconsistent descriptions of the apparition, a common feature of collective delusion. Some saw a tall figure draped in a white burial shroud, while others reported a more monstrous creature wearing a calfskin hide, complete with horns and large, ghastly glass eyes. Basically, think of a minotaur-like monster, and you wouldn't be far off at all. Notably, this phantom wasn't just some passive observer. A local brewer later testified that the entity had leaped from behind a tombstone and seized him by the throat. Unsubstantiated but widely circulated rumors claimed that a pregnant woman had been slain by the ghost. Another story told of a wagon driver who, upon seeing the specter, abandoned his team of 8 horses and 16 passengers to flee in terror. These stories found fertile ground in the cultural soil of the early 19th century, a time when scientific rationalism hadn't yet displaced deep-seated folk traditions. The community quickly developed a backstory for their tormentor, and determined that he was a restless spirit of a man who did the deed to himself. According to prevailing religious doctrine, an individual such as this couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, as it was thought their soul would be unable to find eternal rest. This man, however, had been interred in the Hammersmith churchyard, so his malevolent presence was seen not just as a random haunting, but as a direct consequence of a spiritual transgression, and the entire community was going to pay for it. Compounding the cultural validation of this supernatural fear was a near-total absence of effective law enforcement. The year was 1804, a full 25 years before Home Secretary Robert Peel would establish London's first professional, centrally organized police force. In this pre-Peel era, maintaining order was a fragmented and often inadequate affair, reliant on a patchwork of elected parish constables and paid night watchmen. These men were poorly equipped and lacked the organization to handle a widespread public panic. To give you a sense of the lack of professionality and organization, some of these watchmen were partly paid in fringe benefits like access to alcohol while on the job. The night watchman on duty during the incident himself claimed to have chased the ghost on a previous night, only for it to escape by shooting off its white sheet into his face. And no, you don't have to rewind. This watchman thought a real ghost threw a white sheet at him to escape, like some sort of salamander losing its tail. If you're wondering who was watching the night watchman, it was basically nobody. His response to the crisis wasn't to call for organized backup, but to agree to join Francis Smith's insane, drunken posse of clowns. Notably, while Smith was an officer in the armed forces, he had no official capacity when it came to community policing whatsoever. On the night of January 3rd, 2 men's paths converged in Black Lion Lane, set on a collision course by a combination of unfortunate choices and the pervasive atmosphere of fear. Thomas Millwood, the young bricklayer, had the profound misfortune of resembling a ghost. His trade required him to wear clothes that were uniformly white: linen trousers, a flannel waistcoat, and an apron, all kept meticulously clean. In the pitch-black, unlit lanes of a village on high alert for a white-shrouded creature, this attire was a serious hazard. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Millwood had been repeatedly warned about the danger. His family and even his landlord had seen the risk and begged him to wear a dark greatcoat over his work clothes when he went out at night. He had actually already been mistaken for the ghost on at least 2 previous occasions, but he basically wrote off the risks of anything serious happening. Francis Smith, the 29-year-old officer, was by all accounts a respectable and mild-mannered man who was eager to play the role of the hero in this tale. Multiple witnesses at his trial would testify to his humane and kind character, and he cared a lot about his community. He took it upon himself to take a leadership role in the posse that was patrolling the streets for the ghost. Francis was scared of ghosts, as was the style at the time when virtually everyone believed them to be a real threat. Because of this, the local pub offered him a strong drink or two to steel his nerves while he was out there on his ghost-busting mission. After Francis Smith realized the gravity of what he had done, he immediately found help and confessed what happened to 2 men, one of whom was named John Locke. But not that famous John Locke, since he would have been around 170 years old at the time. After transporting the body of Thomas Millwood to the Black Lion Inn with the help of the men, he immediately and promptly surrendered to a local constable expressing remorse. When Francis Smith stood trial at the Old Bailey just over a week later, he wasn't judged by the standards of a terrified villager, but by the cold, rigid logic of 19th century English law. The case exposed a deep chasm between common-sense morality and the strict letter of legal doctrine. Smith was charged with having ended the life of Millwood willfully and pleaded not guilty, his defense resting on the claim that he had made an honest and tragic mistake. He had believed he was confronting a dangerous supernatural entity and was in a state of mortal terror. The jury was clearly moved by this argument. They heard extensive testimony about the widespread panic the ghost had caused, the violent nature of its reported attacks, and Smith's own good character and profound remorse. After deliberating for an hour, they returned a verdict that reflected this sympathy. He was guilty of the much lesser crime of manslaughter, which acknowledged that he committed the act but had no malicious forethought whatsoever. It was a verdict that seemed to align with a sense of fairness and the tragedy that occurred. Literally nobody in the community thought Francis Smith committed this act intentionally in any way whatsoever. However, the presiding judge, Lord Chief Baron Sir Archibald MacDonald, flatly refused to accept the jury's finding. But before you think he's the villain in the case here, his actions would actually save the life of Smith. He informed the jury that, under the law as it stood, there were no circumstances in the case that could reduce the crime. Their only options were to find Smith guilty or to acquit him entirely. MacDonald's reasoning was a masterclass in the inflexible legal interpretation of the era. The judge held that Smith's actions met none of the criteria for the lesser charge. There was no evidence of self-defense, as Millwood had not attacked him, and he had merely advanced down the lane without responding to a challenge. Smith's subjective belief that he was facing a ghost was legally irrelevant. The law judged the objective act, not the actor's mistaken perception. MacDonald's most devastating point, however, was what became known as the best case fallacy. MacDonald, being an educated man of the Enlightenment, didn't accept the idea that a bullet could fell a ghost. The best case fallacy meant that Smith could have only reasonably believed that it was a human prankster impersonating a ghost. Impersonating a ghost and scaring people was a minor public nuisance offense at the time, and was punishable with as little as a warning. It wasn't a felony that could have ever justified the use of such extreme force. This judicial instruction left the jury with no room to maneuver. Trapped by the law's rigid logic, they were forced to reverse their decision and return a verdict of guilty, and this was a capital offense. Francis Smith, the mild-mannered man who set out to protect his community from a phantom, was sentenced to be hanged by the neck. The trial demonstrated how the legal system of the day operated like a machine, incapable of processing the messy, irrational data of human fear and honest error. The verdict wasn't a failure of the judge, who correctly applied the law, but a failure of the law itself to accommodate the complexities of the human mind. The legally correct but morally troubling verdict immediately set other forces in motion, revealing a more complex ecosystem of justice that operated beyond the courtroom walls. And just wait for it, because our friend Lord Justice MacDonald is going to put on a true masterclass of getting the right result while working within the strict confines of the system. The public reaction to Smith's sentence was one of overwhelming sympathy. Contemporary accounts describe the courtroom spectators as being deeply moved by his obvious contrition and terror at his fate. The entire country became convinced that the law was going to eliminate an innocent man, and this groundswell of public feeling had an immediate effect. Lord MacDonald, despite his rigid application of the law during the trial, was sensitive to the unique circumstances, and he decided to put the concept of justice above the law. He announced in court that he would immediately report the case to the king, George III. As any fan of this period of history knows, George III was completely mentally incapable by this point, so all royal decisions were made by his son, Prince George. This engaged a parallel justice system, the royal prerogative of mercy, an ancient power allowing the monarch to temper the strict sentences of the courts. The crown acted with remarkable speed, and the sentence was suspended almost immediately, while the crown figured out what to do. A few weeks later, Smith's sentence was officially commuted to 1 year of hard labor, as an acknowledgement that you can't simply get wasted and start blasting in urban areas. He was ultimately granted a full pardon and released after serving only about 6 months of his sentence. This royal intervention was a tacit admission from the highest authority in the land that the law had produced an unjust outcome. While the formal legal system was grappling with the consequences of the shooting, an informal system of social pressure was solving the original mystery. The intense publicity surrounding the trial and the tragic slaying of Thomas Millwood weighed on the conscience of the real, quote-unquote, ghost. 2 days after the shooting, a local boot and shoemaker named John Graham came forward and confessed. His motive was shockingly mundane and disproportionate to the terror he had caused. Graham explained that his apprentice had been scaring his young children with ghost stories. As a form of revenge, Graham decided to dress in a white sheet and frighten the apprentice on his way home through the churchyard. The prank was so successful that he apparently continued it for sport, becoming the infamous Hammersmith Ghost. When he surrendered to the local magistrates, they found themselves in a legal quandary. Given that his normally minor public nuisance offense had led to a tragedy, they were unsure exactly how to charge him. To bring a big case and leave the man with a fine seemed almost insulting to the legacy of Millwood, so they released him on the condition that he never impersonate a ghost again, and according to the historical record, he never did. In one final weird historical mystery arising from this case, something strange began to happen after. People began to claim to see the true spirit of Thomas Millwood in Hammersmith, and at the Black Lion Inn, where his body was taken that night. This has raised the question whether John Graham, the so-called real Hammersmith ghost, was the only person dressing up and scaring people at the time. Given that the ghost sightings went on for years after, I have a few thoughts about this part of the Hammersmith enigma. I suspect John Graham may have continued being a public nuisance regardless of telling the authorities that he wouldn't be one. After all, his initial story is quite odd since he managed to scare his apprentice but just kept doing it anyway. Further, given that the case had become a nationwide phenomenon, I also think that some thrill seekers may have tossed on a sheet in a one-off event. As for the sightings within the Black Lion Inn itself, it seems like a mass hysteria event overlaid upon a sincere belief in ghosts. After all, if there was anyone who would be a vengeful spirit in this situation, it was Thomas Millwood, the innocent man who was walking home in his work-mandated clothing. In the spring of 1883, a gruesome incident on a remote ranch near Eagle Creek in southeastern Arizona shook the entire frontier community. Two ranchers had left to tend livestock, leaving their wives behind. Around midday, one wife stepped outside to fetch water when she heard dogs frantically barking and then a piercing human scream. The other woman ran to the window and saw a gigantic reddish beast stampede past, carrying what looked like a devilish rider on its back. Panicked, she barricaded the door until the men returned. That evening, they found the other woman's body trampled in the mud. Enormous cloven hoof prints scarred the ground, and clumps of long red hair clung to nearby bushes. The monster had vanished, and the stunned ranchers had no idea what creature they were dealing with. News of the attack spread quickly through the Arizona territory. Some of the Spanish-speaking locals even began calling the creature a name that translated as the Red Ghost, and the name stuck in English as well. In the weeks that followed, similar incidents were blamed on the Red Ghost. A miners' camp was allegedly assaulted in the dark, and a freight wagon train was attacked by a giant red animal at night. In each case, people found the same signs the next morning: huge hoof prints and tufts of coarse reddish hair left behind. As the legend grew, so did the embellishments. Some swore the beast vanished like a specter when pursued, or that it devoured a grizzly bear. Obvious frontier exaggerations. Yet everyone agreed on one point. The beast carried a human skeleton on its back, strapped in place with ropes or rawhide. The legend truly took hold after one encounter produced hard evidence. A group of prospectors spotted the Red Ghost on a distant mesa and opened fire, attempting to bring the creature in. They missed the beast, but as it fled, something fell from its back. When the men approached, they discovered a human skull with bits of dried flesh and hair still clinging to it. This gruesome find confirmed that the spectral rider wasn't actually a ghost at all, but were the bleached remains of a man. Some began to suspect that the Red Ghost might be a camel. In fact, just a few decades earlier, the Army had imported camels to the Southwest, hoping they could serve as pack animals in the desert. The camels survived the harsh climate well, but they spooked other animals and proved difficult for cavalrymen, familiar with horses, to handle. The Civil War interrupted this Camel Corps experiment, and the Army eventually abandoned the project. Many camels were sold off or processed into camel steaks, but others were simply turned loose into the wild. By the 1880s, sightings of feral camels in Arizona weren't uncommon. This history offered a plausible explanation for the Red Ghost. It was likely one of those abandoned camels, albeit one saddled with a ghastly extra passenger. According to traditional tellings, in 1893, the Red Ghost met its end. A farmer spotted a massive red camel grazing on his land and decided to cut it down with a single blast. Personally, That wouldn't be my first thought if I saw a camel on my property, but to each their own, I suppose. On examining the fallen beast, he found rawhide straps still wrapped around its body, indicating that it was a camel that had gone feral at some point. According to traditional Arizona camel lore, this fact confirmed that this was indeed the camel that previously had the skeleton strapped to it. With the creature slain, the question remained: whose bones were those, and how did they end up on a camel's back? In the aftermath, various explanations arose. One story held that the skeleton was a desperate prospector who lashed himself to a camel, hoping it would lead him to water. If this story is true, I think this prospector should have done some more reading on camels first. Last I checked, a camel is just about the worst animal to strap yourself to in hopes that it'll lead you to a drink. Another claimed the victim was forcibly tied to the camel and sent out into the desert, surely dooming the man. According to this version of events, the pattern of the binding supported the idea that someone else had tied the man onto the animal. In other words, a cruel human act, rather than something supernatural, potentially led to the Red Ghost's tragic creation. After the Red Ghost's demise, reports of wild camels in Arizona dwindled, and by the early 20th century, the last of the Camel Corps strays had died off or been captured. Notably, skeptics question whether the story of the camel being shot down in 1893 is true at all, or whether that's simply part of the legend. The only parts of the story that can truly be verified is the fact that people in late 19th century Arizona believed Red Ghost existed. A camel sighting would have likely been quite jarring, and there were numerous feral camels, so it makes perfect sense that a mythos would have developed around them. At the end of the day, this ghostly dromedary may be nothing more than an Old West tall tale that's come down to us modern people as at least having a kernel of truth.